next speaker is the wonderful David Dempsey. Now, David is tuning in here from Adelaide in Australia, and he's a former government engineer and now passionate STEM educator. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Cathy. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you here. The first question that I've got for you is, what do you see some of the challenges are in the current education system?
Oh, well, I think teachers work really hard to deliver a curriculum to students, but I don't know that that's still what's needed anymore. That students very often run over in the process. An average of them go through okay. Those who don't catch up so well often are left behind. And the very bright students often get bored and disconnected. And I'm working with some of those students at the moment to see what we can do to change that around.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about here, isn't it? It's about igniting the passion and igniting that energy and enthusiasm in the education system, really, isn't it?
True. There's a great potential there, and I think what I'm driven by is that waste of potential. When I see young people who are very bright, they're very cluey. Maybe a particular teacher might have an ego problem with working with a bright student who's may actually know more than them about certain things. And the difference when there's a teacher there who really gets that and helps extend that student into something that's challenging and interesting.
It makes a huge difference, doesn't it? What's one thing that you wish you'd learnt at school?
More about myself, to first understand who I am, and because I've always felt a bit out of it, like I'm not quite. There's something not quite right with me, and if I'd understood that that's actually a power and a strength, I had trouble, I think, sometimes getting into the regular social groups, and usually I'd drift into groups with just 2 or 3 friends who were deeply interested in science or technology or something similar, the nerd group, and eventually I broadened my horizons and got on top of a lot of the issues that I had in learning. But I think largely if I understood that was actually that we are all different, and if that was understood that some people are fantastic at sports, some people are really good at maths, some love learning, some people may be better working with people rather than with things, and I think that initially would have been a very relieving thing, so that I could focus on learning and just being my best.
It would have made a real difference, wouldn't it? Yeah. And so that brings us to what you're doing now. And you're a former government engineer, and now you're a passionate STEM educator. So what's brought you down that journey? What's made you passionate about what you're doing now?
I think I've always been involved with my children. I have 3 older children who went through schools 20 years ago. I was always keen to understand what they were learning. If they were struggling with something, maybe I could help them with part of that. I've been a tutor at different times to different levels, from primary, secondary, and also tertiary education. And that helping people to learn something and that they can suddenly do something they couldn't do last week, and now they're on top of it. That's I find very empowering. As I worked in defence, there's a government scientist in schools program, and so I hooked into that, and with a bunch of other people. We work with the school directly and typically with the teachers to help develop any PD that they're a bit stuck on. Some teachers come back to something like electromagnetism. They have to deliver it in year 11 or 12, and they go, I'm not sure that I know. I've got to recall stuff that I didn't really get the first time. And so for me to sit down with them and sometimes just work through it, answer any questions, and show them perhaps some examples. Or different ways. I often introduce new tools into the schools to say, here's something you might want to consider. It's really up to the teacher to deliver that. They know the curriculum, they know their students, they understand how easy is that going to be to get that tool into the school IT system, for instance. So that's not my part of the job. But where I've been able to work with teachers who want me involved and are often keen for me to work with the students in the classroom, the students find it engaging that there's somebody here who's a defence scientist or a research engineer, and to be able to answer questions. And I find that enthusing for me, and the government encourages this. Our CEO encouraged our connection with schools because he realised they are the people who will eventually come and work for the government and private enterprise. But also it's stimulating for the staff to go do something a little bit different and to be able to share what we know to help improve the education system. So it's a win all around, and a really great collaboration.
And you've led into that in terms of what it is that you're doing in the different classes and helping the students. But why is it so important for you that this happens?
Initially, it was just a joy of helping people learn things. I'm also have been a gymnastic coach, a martial arts teacher, and so on. And I like that the ability to help somebody learn something that they want to learn and they enjoy doing. Changing the world through other people is a very powerful thing. I'm not so interested in material wealth and that sort of thing. That doesn't drive me. But making change in the world that's positive really is. And I think I have a sense that some of the reason we're in this existential crisis that we are in numerous directions, with the financial crisis we had a few years ago, the environmental problems we've known about for a long time and paid lip service to changing. And then when the rubber hits the road and a decision comes to Parliament, very often the politicians, who mostly are business and economics majors, have very little understanding at a deep level. When people talk about nonlinear change, for instance, the politicians they don't know what that means, so they just ignore it, they gloss over it. That might be the actual key point in a message from some expert scientist. Nonlinear change can mean you can flip into global warming that isn't reversible. And so, for instance, the politicians may be making decisions based on the best they understand and their best appreciation of the problem. But if they don't have that deeper understanding, not to an expert level, but just an understanding of the fundamental things that the scientists and experts perhaps are presenting to them, then they won't really feel it. They'll hear it, they'll listen to it, they'll ignore it, as opposed to having a deep feeling of, oh my goodness, a nonlinear change, that could be really bad. And so what I'm wanting to do is, if we can help increase the general public's knowledge about science, technology, engineering, maths, and how the arts connect in with that as well, because that's a very creative part that's often left out. If we can help students to develop those deep understandings and skills, if the teachers can learn how to deliver that in a way that enthuses the students, we'll end up in 10 to 20 years' time, the voters of the country will be people who do deeply understand the risks when scientists explain it. And hopefully more politicians will have that deep background as well. So they will also understand what's happening and perhaps have less fear about stepping into something unknown, because maybe an engineer can say, look, don't worry about their low risk problems, whereas a politician might see a future in renewable energy, for instance. They might see that as much higher risk than mining uranium, which is a bit like mining coal. That's an easy shift to make because it's just all mining. To change from using coal to some other technology, people who aren't really expert in that may have fears that if they had a bit more knowledge about the technologies themselves, they might see them as opportunities. So in a big sense, I'm trying to work from the ground up, because working directly to influence the politicians in their decisions has some impact. But I think longer term, we need a change which actually makes our society more understanding of the technologies that drive it, and are the risks for it too.
And so much of that is about changing the way that we're teaching science, technology, engineering, maths. And I love how you're bringing in the arts there. And because the arts is another area that is so forgotten in so many ways. It's an area of the site that I know many art students, who feel that part of their learning, part of themselves, is not valued in the current education system. So I'm really pleased to see that the STEM for you has grown into STEAM. And yeah,
that was actually a change for me too, Cathy, because initially I was focusing just on STEM. And I did have this bit of that sort of sense of, no, I don't really want to clutter it up with more and more things that, that maybe for political reasons people are adding in. But as I thought about it, and I don't know what changed, but in thinking about it, and it might have actually been a project that I thought of to work with students in, and that's the physics of music and the music of physics, as an example of how we might engage students more. And I suddenly realized, well, music's art. And so, of course, and that really opened up my view about how we might do this. It's not about tacking something on that doesn't belong there. Just like architecture is a beautiful blend of beauty and engineering. It's civil engineering, but if civil engineers built buildings, they'd be ugly. You need somebody with that ability to take the basic design and incorporate some amazing sort of human values that are intangible into that. in Australia, the government's released new costings for degrees, and what they've done is exactly what you're describing. They've said, oh, look, the arts aren't, for whatever reason, they're going to be much more expensive to do arts courses, languages and whatever, because we're focusing on STEM. And I fear a future where people, artists, linguists, people who understand history so we don't repeat it, if they're not doing their degrees because they're not seen as being valued, not only as a personal hazard to those people who feel undervalued, but what's our society end up looking like?
That's real fear. I hadn't heard that. So thank you for bringing that information in as well, because that's quite a scary thought, actually, because we learn so much through having that broad base. One of the other things that you have brought up through that is the importance of integrating the learning through, you know, taking the science, taking the art, and the joy, if you like, that is there, and understanding what's going on, the breadth of things that the understanding that we can gain from that. And that's one of the real challenges in the way that particularly our high school education is taught, isn't it? Is because it is so compartmentalized and so in many ways theoretical for many different reasons. But when you are able to really tap into some of those joys that our students have, and being able to open their eyes to some of that beauty that is there through that, the physics of sound, if you like, it really is incredible, isn't it? And it can inspire passion, it can inspire excitement in the students that are exposed to it, and that is part of what we're talking about in real education, isn't it?
Yes, I think when I was a student, I really had this sense of there were things I didn't want to be bothered learning. So history, you know, why would I want to learn that? I can't see the value to me in that. And until I had a history teacher who was enthusing, and he got us really inspired to go find out about, you know, what happened in India when the changeover happened from English rule, what happened in China over its long history, what did they do there, how are they different from us? And his passion enthused me to go find out all about these things. I frankly hated learning Latin. I went to a Catholic school. Latin was on the curriculum, and I thought, if I have to do a language, why can't we do something useful? So I'm very much about the utility. Latin, though, is of course the basis of our language, and my partner's a linguist. We love talking about words, the origins, and when my son's in the room and we're talking about that, he's picking up on lots of things that I'd be bereft of knowing if I didn't have that understanding of at least the basics of our language. So I'm very grateful. And again, I had a teacher there who was, instead of having boring poetry, he brought us the stories of centurions and how heavy a pack do they have to lug around and have to carry all their water for a 5-day march, and, you know, just the practicalities of life. And it was the same sort of challenges that maybe we have today, but in ancient times.
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly it, isn't it? So many of the young people that I've spoken to as well have talked about the importance of that inspiring teacher. We had a past teacher in our last summit, and she talked about never underestimating the power that you can provide for your students and the impact that you will make by being that inspiration for them. So it's absolutely true, isn't it?
Yep. I've often had that sort of example of the changes in my life, my decisions have often been changed by somebody who was very passionate and very knowledgeable about their topic, and who just loved sharing it, and, you know, couldn't get enough of it. My early influences in learning about science were my father, who was a technician in telecom. So anytime we had an interest in something or a question, he could answer it, but also he would then go and get an electronic hobby project kit or something for me to play with. Julius Sumner Miller was a great influence on TV through the ABC programs. I used to tape record his lectures on physics and then transcribe them. And those people really stimulated my interest, and then watered and curated it as things went along. They encouraged, they helped. Some teachers encouraged us to bring experiments from home into the classroom in primary school. And that ability to share what I was learning with my colleagues was really great fun. And they're the things I think that really, you know, we help students to go through those processes and learn things, and to learn the hard things, to stick out the hard things, because there's a payoff. When I learned maths, there was, you know, I could now suddenly do a certain type of problem. If I learned about Pythagoras, and then trigonometry, I could do other things. I could understand more about how things worked if I understood the physics. And I think that, and sharing that enthusiasm and that inspiration about why do we want to learn this, you'll understand why bridges are built a certain shape so they don't fall down, and so on. So it is the enthusiasm.
Absolutely. I vividly remember from my primary school as well, and one of the teachers told us to get a glass jar and fill it completely to the top with water and put a lid on it, and then put it in the freezer overnight and bring it to school the next day. Okay.
Yes.
Only 2 made it to school.
Wow. Yes. And they would have been hazardous.
Yes, very hazardous. Every other one broke, of course, as you expected.
Yeah.
And she did have a class of very sad students, but but we've remembered that however many years later, So this is the type of learning, isn't it? Where you're provoking thinking and it's experiential, and you get to see this broken jar and realize that, I wonder why that happened.
So Julius Sumner Miller's program was called Why Is It So? And he didn't sit and give people lectures with lots of equations. He said that it really turned students off. He also said his job wasn't to teach students, and it wasn't to teach physics. It was to enthuse the inquiring mind and to put up a problem and say, why does that happen? And sometimes he wouldn't answer it. He'd leave it for students to go and think about. Or he would ask what looks like a trivially simple question: why is ice slippery? And people would just, well, it is. But he would say, but why is it slippery? And then go into, and he would explain a little of the physics, but he would do it in a hand-wavy way, maybe one equation or two. But generally it was about enthusing people's interest to say, gee, that's really weird. And now I know that, I understand how that bit of physics helps me. And so he left it then for the students, then the enthused student, to go off and find out the information and listen to the teacher at school about ice and how it expands or contracts, and under pressure it melts and so on.
And some of his videos are still on YouTube, aren't they? So, and they're really, really fun to watch. Very dry.
Yes, there's one. Yes, he's a very engaging man, and he liked tricking people. He would create a vacuum in a container. He would open the lid and he would say, "Who heard the vacuum rush out?" And of course, some people would say, "Oh, yes, I heard it." And then he'd say, "Nonsense! There's no vacuum rushing out; it's the air rushing in." And so he didn't mind, playing with people, stirring them up a little bit to get that energy going, to have them question what looks like something obvious. And I think that's a great thing, to set puzzles for students to work on and to chew on a little bit, rather than here's a question, here's the answer, and to teach rote by rote.
That leads really well into this next question, where you talk about how can we help students learn those abstract subjects like maths and particle physics, for example, because I know the number of students that, they get to maths class, particularly when you get to high school, and they just turn off. It's like, I can't do maths. It's that mindset. So what can teachers do to change that?
So one of my greatest challenges and disappointments was one of my children they're not a disappointment. The disappointment for me was that one of my children really struggled, and even though she worked really hard with her maths teacher and so on to learn things, she had this view that says, I don't have a maths brain. And initially I thought, I don't know that that's true. Maybe you just haven't been shown the right ways. But I've come to understand that I believe some people, and this is getting back to the individuality of teaching, that some students, I believe, struggle with abstraction. And they are typically people who don't pick up the nuance in a conversation where you're talking about some abstract concept, and they leap back into they think you're talking about some practical thing. So I have a suspicion there's more research needed there about some students who really don't get maths. But she was actually really good at geometry. So I have a suspicion that if the mathematics is concrete, you can draw shapes, they're obvious, and we use them in the real world. So I think acknowledging that not everyone has an ability to really do deep maths, but most of us have a great ability to understand things that are displayed in a concrete way. So bringing more examples of maths into the classroom in concrete ways, helping students to go out and take measurements, for instance, and then come into the classroom and do averages on them, to look at COVID, for instance, and use that as a model and go explore historically what have we done with pandemics in a math sense. Let's look at exponential functions. Let's do predictions. Let's look at politics, look at the policies different countries are applying, look at the maths to see how does that turn out for them. I think those are the ways where we help students see maths in action as useful, and that it helps us answer a question and perhaps do something different. So it makes a difference. For those things like particle physics, you can actually teach quite young children an elementary model of an atom, for instance. Often what we teach them is the historically wrong model. That's the basic one with electrons spinning around a nucleus. And then later on, we have to unteach them that and say, well, that's not really how it works. It's really like this. And of course, when you get to high school, they say, well, it's not really even like that. It's like this. And then eventually you go to university and they say, well, it's not even like any of that. It's actually completely different. Our current thinking is it's like this. I think sometimes if the real model was taught in a slightly different way in primary school, as a basic thing, and maybe they wouldn't understand it completely, but they might actually start with the correct model, and then it adds more finesse can be added along the way. So I think there's a number of things. Firstly, acknowledging we're all different, so understanding our strengths and weaknesses in the way we learn. Secondly, understanding how we learn best. I typically like to have a framework presented, then hear about the topic, then read about it, then do some problems, and then come back and ask some questions. For me, that particular path typically works best for me. So having things like simulations of mathematics that students can access, and being able to look at real numbers, the real COVID statistics are out in the world. So the great thing is classes can access those. So connecting maths with the real world, connecting the abstract with the concrete, I think those things really do help. And also having enthusiastic teachers.
Absolutely. The enthusiastic teachers are really, really important. And I think one of the things that we've seen in the last year is, and beyond that actually, is a real distrust in a way of science. And that if we're able to teach in a different way and have people really engage in this, have our students engage in it a different way, then that would increase that understanding and get rid of some of that distrust, if you like.
So I think the distrust can come from politicians who have a particular viewpoint they're trying to push. And so when Dr. Fauci in the United States, for instance, came out with some advice, and then 3 months later he says, oh, no, we need to wear masks. I did, before he'd said maybe not. That's on the basis that the information had come in and shown that that was actually important to change our mind. And the great thing about science is it does change its mind. Sometimes it's very hard. I mean, one scientist would prefer to use another's toothbrush rather than their theory. But they will eventually change their mind if the evidence comes in. And so what Dr. Fauci was demonstrating was science in action, whereas the politicians were saying, oh, you're flip-flopping all over the place. And so I think for people, again, if the public understand that's not what's happening, because they understand how science really works, then perhaps politicians won't try and use those arguments, because the public will see through it as being just something that's a political argument.
Mm-hmm. So who were your biggest influences? You've talked about your father, you've talked about Mr. Milsner, Dr. Milsner.
Yep, Julie Summerlin. Yep.
That's right. I've got the name. Julie Summerlin.
So I think the other people who, like Julie Summerlin, who are out in the world as scientists who connect with the public. Brian Cox in the UK is a brilliant example of someone who can take very complex concepts and break them down in such a way that people in the public who don't have the deep maths background, but they can still understand them. There are many other people and some of them are quite anonymous. They're people I've bumped into as teachers who just presented something in a certain way, and just the way they explained it just sort of suddenly opened up an area. I think Stephen Hawking, Professor Hawking, was somebody who, The Brief History of Time is a little tiny book, but it's so full of things that if you don't understand them, they just sound like it's nonsense. For those of us who've done a little bit of study, it's very inspiring to actually read and have a beautifully conceptualized model of a grand theory of everything and why it's so difficult to create. So I think those scientists, having people who are expert in their field come into the classroom, come on TV, and for those of us who are interested in science, not everyone is, but for those of us who are, I find them very inspiring. David Suzuki, I must also say, I went to one of his lectures in Canberra, a personal one. He scared me. He was talking about, the end of the world's coming, and basically he didn't know whether we have time to reverse it. And for me, that's what our scientists need to be able to say, is something controversial without feeling like they're going to be criticized by their colleagues. His work in terms of we can't take an organism out of nature and put it in a lab and break it down and think we understand it, devoid of its environment. That's a very powerful concept. Also, his work with the Inuit people and others to say our elders in different cultures have lessons for us if we're prepared to listen. And again, this is where the STEAM concept is important, because it acknowledges different ways of thinking of science in terms of what ancient people know about it.
And again, it's that holistic view, isn't it? Absolutely. So, okay, how do you engage with students? Because you are working as a STEAM educator now. How are you engaging with the students to help them in their learning?
So the first part really is working in the classroom. What I knew was that I didn't know what the teachers' challenges were. So me coming in with a solution and saying, here you go, I've got the perfect thing for you, would not work. I recognised that I didn't know what their challenges really were. So that was very important for me to find educators who were prepared to, let me into their classroom to work with their students, to talk with them. That's been very valuable in terms of me understanding what pressure they're under to deliver a small module of information in 50 minutes. And they spend 10 minutes getting the class settled down, 30 minutes maybe doing some work, another 20 minutes packing up and the next thing. So my great technology solutions that I came in with, sometimes they'd say, well, I don't have time for that to break down. So helping me find the right ways is really important too, as well. The second thing really is about some of the STEM challenges that the schools run. So a submarines in school project, which is run by one of the engineering associations here. Schools have, I think it's 10 weeks to build a submarine or a remote piloted underwater vehicle. And then at the end of that, they go to a pool and they put it in the water and they try it out and they see how it goes. And they also do a marketing program with that, so because they've got to raise funds. So there's some of the students do the marketing, some of them, and they arrange for t-shirts and hats and the team colours and all that sort of aspect. And the school had arranged it so that this is done using maths, science, and some of the English time, so that the students had a decent chunk of time each week to work on and make progress in this challenge. Because I work in defence, what I'm not allowed to do is to give the students answers, but where they got stuck on some technical issue, I was allowed to help them to resolve that so they could keep making progress. And I think these are the sort of things where, and the students I spoke to there were often the nerdy kids who often felt, left out. And when I asked them, how did you find this environment, this challenge? They were the ones who said, oh, this is the best time of my week because, I really love this. And I could see how powerful those were going to be the people who would go and work in engineering companies in the future, because they had an experience of it in school, as opposed to going through school, getting to the end of it, and then looking around, where do I get a job? And not having a sense of what that sort of work might be like. Mm-hmm. So that's what I enjoy most. Currently, I'm working on creating some online materials for teachers and students and those perhaps who are homeschooling. Eventually to have a range of things and programs where I can work remotely and perhaps with bigger groups of people.
Mm. Would you be able to share some of those thoughts? Because I know you talked before about the maths of sound, the physics of sound. So tell us about that, because it's a beautiful piece of work that you've created to help people look at what's happening with that sound.
So I think, and this was something again which tied into the bringing the arts into this. One of my other passions is music. I learnt piano from my sister, who was a teacher. But also, when you look at how sound is produced, and if you understand the physics of it and the maths of it, you can then create different types of sounds in modern instruments. One of the things I always wanted to do as a music student, I did an electronic music topic in my Year 11 subject. I really wanted to be able to create electronic music, but unfortunately that wasn't possible. We didn't have the synthesizers, we didn't have recording in studios and things. But today this is an elementary trivial thing on a PC or a Mac. There are digital audio workbenches, which are basically electronic music platforms, and you can import instruments and create symphonies or whatever you like. And so this allows people, if they're music students, to learn about good composition, to be able to harmonize things, and to learn again, the technicalities of music can be boring to learn, but if you're creating them in your notation for your DAW to be able to create music, it's just something that you learn, and it's all embedded in what you're doing. if you understand the waveforms that the instruments make as a physics student, then you can understand why a reed instrument sounds like it does as opposed to a flute. A flute has a very sinusoidal waveform. It's very nice and smooth, and it's a single note usually is played. Something like a bassoon or other reed instrument has a vibration which is like a square wave. It has lots of components. It's very much more rich in terms of the harmonic content. So again, if you understand the maths, you can take that waveform that it produces and break it down to understand what all the harmonics are that are in it, and why sometimes it can sound a bit clashy, because it has a lot of clashy sort of harmonics. In these virtual instruments, we can create those waveforms and we can try them out and hear what they sound like. Not only that, but one of the things I've found as I was looking into this, if you play a note and chop out a little bit of the middle bit of the note that's played, and then replicate it over and over and play it for a tone, like a tone. If you take a piece of piano, a piece of flute, and a piece of trumpet, and you chop out the middle bit and play them, it's very hard to tell the instruments apart. They all sound much the same. And what I come to understand was that the envelope, the shape of how loud and soft a note plays, so a piano has a very loud part and then it decays slowly to nothing. A flute is quite consistent and drops, and trumpets sort of come up very sharply and drop off very sharply. And those envelopes actually contain a lot of information for our brains as to which note I'm hearing. I don't know how that works. And again, that's helped me to think about, well, how does anatomy and physiology fit into physics and music and all of the other things? And if you think about that, then you get to a music appreciation. Why do certain notes sound nice and certain ones clash? Why are certain announcers' voices on radio? I find some of them are quite raucous and some of them are very, very melodious and pleasant. What's different in those? And when you get down looking at waveforms, you can start to appreciate why that might be the case in terms of harmonics and things. So it can turn, so from just playing music on a computer is great fun, that can open up into a big exploration in lots of different directions. And so different students can come to one topic like this, and each of them can run off and look at a different aspect and then bring it back to the class and share with their contemporaries to say, well, this is how the brain works in that way. This is how the reed instrument creates its sound physically. This is what the mathematics is telling us. And I think that sort of environment where we're learning from our peers, not only it helps value the work the students just done because their colleagues want to hear it, but also it's more engaging because I know that I'm going to have to give a presentation to my class about the waveforms or something. I'm much more motivated to pull it together because I'm going to be sharing it with my friends and colleagues. So that's just one example of something, and the power of including the arts as an aspect of that. And of course, history students could look back at the history of instruments, where they came from, and why there weren't brass instruments until we had manufacture of brass things, and so on. So I think there's a lot of benefit in having that integration of lots of subjects into a project or a topic, and then allowing the students to share with each other their knowledge, so they all learn. It's a very powerful idea. Hard, and difficult in the classroom if you've got 50-minute slots. So that's where I'm thinking that a lot of that organisation of how students apply time to their learning really needs to change in some significant ways.
And because what you're talking about there requires the students to be able to explore the different sounds as well, to actually have access to the different instruments that they might be interested in exploring, and then being able to listen to them. And another thing that I've got being pictured in my mind here is a form of music that has become much more common recently, which is recording things on loop and then people layering in the extra sounds so that you've got these incredible layers. And I see a lot of people doing that sort of music nowadays. And wow, it opens up so many more possibilities, doesn't it? And I can imagine an entire class of people, being able to explore these things in a whole heap of different ways. And I think one of the issues with this is, how do you assess this? This is not something that you can sit in an exam and necessarily write about, but it is so much more valuable for the people that are involved in that.
And I think that's a real, I can see that as a significant driver that interrupts the changes that might be possible. So for instance, our government here do universal testing at various age levels for the basics, reading, writing and arithmetic. and they then put that information back to the parents, basically to give them indications of which schools are doing well and which teachers and classes are doing well, which is really, I find that information would be useful for the schools, the principals and teachers, and that's where that should go. But what it forces then is it forces teachers to teach to the test. And I know for my children, a lot of the ways they were learning very creatively in some classrooms changed very rapidly when the testing came in. The teachers weren't confident to teach in the way they were doing it in a more experimental way, because they recognised that they were being tested tested for the students to learn fundamental, simple things, not to go exploring. And I think that can put a creativity killer on this sort of idea. So assessment really comes down to trusting that the teacher, in working in a class with students, is mindful and watching and can see how do students go. So for instance, the very bright students, they should be expecting them to be doing more than perhaps students who struggle with a topic. What they're looking for, what they should be looking for, is how is the student applying themselves? What are they bringing that they know to the table? How are they working in the teams? And if they're all doing that well, then maybe the teacher should be saying, well done, you're all pass. And if not, certain students, here's some feedback, for next time, and some development perhaps, to sort of sit down with students and say, maybe we need to work with you on your team work, and how do we do that? And the leaders of a team, maybe how do we help you to bring the team together through that process? So I think I agree with you. I think assessment is a key thing that's actually stopping us from, because we're not trusting that the teacher might be able to look at the class and say, you're doing well. And also for the students to know that they're progressing and they'll be okay. By the time they leave school, they'll be ready to go into some workforce position or their own business or study.
It's interesting you talk about the group work there, because that is something that a few schools are teaching, and there are a lot of schools that are not teaching. And so I've heard many university students go off to university and they're doing group assessments, but the number of people I've heard say, we turned up to the final presentation and this person that we thought had dropped out of university way at the beginning is there in our presentation, and they get our mark despite the fact that they've had no communication into the group. They've done none of the work. All they've done is show up to the final assessment and they get our grades. And they're saying about the unfairness of that. And so this is very much a part of it, isn't it? Is being able to teach those group skills, and how do we engage with groups? Because this is some of the stuff that is becoming more and more important for people heading out of school.
So my partner's a linguist, and one of the things we approached my son's school about was exactly that thing. My son is often involved, and because he's fairly bright, and even in a stream of Ignite students, he's often the one who's more interested in let's get on with it and do the thing. He's often more organised, more motivated, and he sometimes struggles with students who have ego battles over who should be doing the drawings and who should be doing, and they waste their time settling that as opposed to getting on with it. And even though teamwork is one of the things that are marked in these assessments, I realised that I've never heard him say, oh yes, we had a conversation today about forming, norming and mourning in teams as a trajectory of typical teams, or these are the 3 characteristics of good communication, or whatever. So I approached the teachers in a class that I was helping with. I had just presented some material about project management for the students doing the subs program. And I asked them about this. How do you teach team dynamics, and how do you teach, individual interpersonal relations and psychology and all that sort of things at this level? And they looked stunned, and they hadn't thought about the fact that, they're assessing teamwork, they're expecting teamwork, but they're not actually teaching teamwork. And so I offered, maybe my partner and I could perhaps come to you and work with you to develop a framework that you can then deliver to the students, because you know them best. But to start talking about those concepts of those issues, the conflicts that arise in any team forming, and how we can help students who are struggling with that. What do we do with them? And then at a certain point, maybe we need to bring in experts, the teacher or a mentor, to sit down with the team and actually work through that team problem and teach them, how do we do that? It's not inherent. You don't grow up, I didn't learn as a baby. It didn't come into my head magically like some other things did. We expect students to do these things. We don't necessarily show them or teach them or lead them to do them.
And then we end up teaching them as adults in work situations, and they've been through a lot of pain and stuff on the way through. So it would be amazing to have much more of that being taught all the way through school. And I know that the program that we're delivering to early childhood teachers is teaching some of those social skills, and it just needs to carry on. This is life skills. Anyway, what would you like youth education to be like in 10 years' time? What would your ideal
Dramatically different. Well, I think it needs to be dramatically different. I just have a strong sense that something's going to change. It really needs to change right now, but it'll take 10 years. I can see signs that it's gradually moving that way. So the first principle I'd say is individuation, that students need to be able to work at their own speed and level and not be held back by the fact that, oh, you're in this class, you can't move to the next one till February next year. The second, and so that's really about, providing materials so that students can always progress at their maximum pace. They're not held back by being in a certain class or being with certain students. Secondly, that thing about the teamwork, I think that's a really key thing. The interpersonal and intrapersonal psychology, I think, could come into schools a lot earlier. The funny thing you mentioned about the preschools, that is actually the one place my son had learnt the very basic principle of assertion, to be able to say, stop, I don't like it. Just teaching that one skill is very powerful for young people. And that's an example of something you can teach. You can start teaching that assertive language and certain other things very early. I think the third thing really is about finding ways to make real the material. So it's not just, oh, you have to learn this because it's in the curriculum. So firstly, the curriculum needs to be reviewed with a view to saying, what do we want our students to be able to do when they're entering university or the workplace or their own business? What do they need to know? And that viewpoint, that aiming point, has changed dramatically over 100 years, but our education stayed mainly the way it was. The second thing is, I think there's a lot of brain science and a lot of personal brain development knowledge that's not really being applied in schools. For instance, a lot of boys should really, I believe the theory is that boys should probably start school a bit later than they typically are at the moment. And some boys may and some boys may not. So again, that might be about, are they ready to start? And it's not just about they're 5 and off to school. It's about, are they ready to be learning? And the second thing is, I think sometimes we're trying to present to children things they're not quite ready for. And often we're not presenting the things that they are actually really set up to do. So maybe in the first couple of years of school, children should perhaps just be learning to interplay, to work together, and also to learn 3 or 4 languages. Their brains are set up in that young time to soak up language. Maybe that's where they could be even taught different subjects in different languages, as they do in some schools. And then later on, start teaching them maths things maybe later than what they currently start doing. Teach them counting, teach them to read the time, maybe a few things like that. And there may be some things that are best left until quite a bit later, where they'll just pick it up quite quickly and naturally. And so I think there's a lot of those sorts of things that need to change, taking into account the reality of the world we're living in. So what's the aiming point for the end of our education, the method we use to get them there, and also how are they as people individually and as a collective. What's typical brain development like in children? Where's the age appropriate time to be teaching them, or the stage appropriate time to be teaching them certain concepts, but always to allow them to lead in terms of what they're interested in, and not hold them back if they're really keen to learn something, to be flexible enough to be able to let them go off on a side tangent if they're really passionate about something and it's an opportunity. So much more flexibility, I think, is the key principle I'd see. Not sure how we do that. It's a big ask, all of that. But I really think unless that changes, parents are starting to move already to take their kids out of school, to unschool them and homeschool them, where they're finding they're not fitting in with the current schooling system very well.
And
I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting there. You talked about the boys being ready to learn at 5, or not ready to learn at 5, and that's one of the things that I see is really interesting, because early childhood, our aspiration statement in New Zealand for our early childhood curriculum is that children should be competent and confident learners and communicators, healthy in mind, body and spirit, secure in their sense of belonging and in knowledge that they make a valued contribution to society. And so within that, you have this idea of these really young children being really competent and confident learners and communicators. And then something happens when they go into school and they lose that curiosity, that spark about learning. And so, yeah, it would be lovely to be able to continue that spark and that joy in learning. And I wonder whether it's the way that the expectations are about how people will learn once they get to school, rather than are they ready to learn? Is it more around, are they ready to sit at a desk and learn in a way that has been prescribed for the last however many years, that this is how you learn, as opposed to a much freer way of learning, which is building on the children's curiosity and their awe and wonder about the world.
I think you're right, and I know, I believe groups like the Waldorf schools, for instance, typically spend the early part of the education about that, about coming together, playing together, working together, learning how we all operate as humans and people, and how do we ask for things. They also, I gather, do more sport in the morning, for instance, to sort of let the kids run off their energy and run off their boisterousness. And so that then in the afternoon do more artistic things where they can actually settle and think and can be creative. And I think that, so recognizing the nature of a child, it's the child's nature to wake up feeling full of energy and ready to go. To then force them to sit at a desk is tragic. And so the idea of socializing, we're told that, oh yes, we have to teach children to socialize, meaning as in behave themselves in the classroom and do what we want them to do so it's convenient for the teacher and the class. I think that's a really traditional thing that really needs to be looked at and changed. Another influence in my life has been my partner, who actually has introduced me to a lot of things like this, about dealing with strong emotions, for instance. Often we will try and calm someone down when they're upset because we don't like the feeling of them being upset in front of us, so we calm them down because we don't like it, as opposed to being able to sit quietly with that strong emotion, just nod and hold their hand and wait for the storm to pass, and then to say, what can I do for you, what can I help you with? And can be very inconvenient because you don't know how long that's going to take, but that's the sort of concept that needs to come into the schools, where we value the child first, not the systematic organizing of a classroom of people to get through a certain curriculum. So being centered on the need of the student, not the need of the education system or the society, putting them first, I think. And there are schools, like I said, the Waldorf school, I think, has that sort of philosophy, and they also do learn maths and things a bit later because they understand that need for that development. So going to the places where things are working better and asking why is it working better may be very important in how we set up education, rather than having schooling, which is just about perhaps regimenting people into particular patterns.
And enabling that individuation, as you talked about before. So fantastic. Thank you so much, David, for sharing your knowledge around STEM and your passion for it, and for it being taught well, for your passion for inspiring students so that the learning becomes real, so that it becomes useful because of the importance of science for the future of humanity, really, the future of our planet as well. So I hope that people will listen and will take some of the things that you've talked about and start continuing those conversations that have been had, so that we can inspire the students here and make it easier for our teachers as well. So David, you've got a question for people to be able to put in the Facebook group. So what's the question that you'd like people to answer?
So for me, I'm looking to connect with people who have a similar interest and perhaps wanting to try some of these ideas out with their students, or connect with me in whatever sense. What I'm interested in from them perhaps is, what's something that I've said today where you've never really thought about it before and you've suddenly thought, wow, that's really important, or wow, that's something that I could do with my students. So if there's something that's really surprised you on what I've said that generates energy, please let me know.
Great. So just pop that in the Facebook group and we'll let David know as well. He'll be in there as well, checking out what people have said. So thank you so much, David, again, for sharing your knowledge with us today and for sharing your passion around STEAM. So wonderful. Thanks,
you. Thanks, Cathy. Appreciate the opportunity.